Good afternoon and welcome to the Elections and Human Rights Discussion Series organized by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. Today's discussion is entitled Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Elections. Since I'm opening this discussion on behalf of the Institute, I would first like to recognize Indigenous peoples of this land, the Lenape people on whose traditional territories we stand today. This event is co-sponsored by Columbia Votes, Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, Social Work Votes, and SEPA's Human Rights and Humanitarian Policy Program. Thank you to them and to all of you for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our panelists and the moderator. I'll briefly introduce Elsa Stamitapulu, who will in turn introduce our panelists and get this conversation started. Elsa Stamitapulu is the director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. Born in Athens, Greece, she has devoted 21 years of her UN work to human rights, in addition to several years exclusively focusing on Indigenous peoples' rights. Most recently, she directed the work program of the Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as its first chief from inception in 2003 to 2010. She also promoted the integration at the international and national levels of UN policies on Indigenous peoples' issues in the areas of economic and social development, environment, health, human rights, education, and culture. She supervised the production of the first ever State of the World's Indigenous Peoples publication of the United Nations in 2010. Thank you to her and to all of you, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Christina, and to all our panelists for being here. Well, it is very well known that since the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, already the right to free and fair elections has been recognized as a human right, and the same idea has been confirmed in the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that the United States has ratified. And in fact, free and fair elections is part of the internal aspect of the right to self-determination. And when we come to Indigenous peoples' rights, their rights have been declared in a most comprehensive instrument, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, which recognizes individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And in that declaration, in Article 3, we have also the recognition of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. So it is a very interesting connection between what free and fair elections mean for Indigenous peoples and how it can be implemented at its best. So in this country, there have been different types of disenfranchisement that have taken place depending on different groups of people. And this has had historical roots, settler colonial, social, political roots, and also legal and constitutional roots. And with us to unpack some of these complex issues are three distinguished panelists that I would now like to introduce to you. Tatewin means is from the Sisseton, Wahpeton Dakota, Oglala Lakota, and Inhakanktawan nations in South Dakota. Tatewin has two children, Mankato and Persaya, and currently lives in Rapid City. She has her degree in environmental engineering from Stanford University with a minor in comparative studies in race and ethnicity, her JD with a concentration in human rights law from the University of Minnesota Law School, and her MA in Lakota leadership and management from Oglala Lakota College. A longtime advocate for human rights, survivors, children, and families, Tatewin means served as an attorney general for the Oglala Sioux tribe on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota from 2012 to 2017. She has also served as a German Marshall Fund Memorial Fellow in 2015. From 2017 to 2018, Tatewin was the Graduate Studies Department Chair at Oglala Lakota College. Currently, Tatewin is the Executive Director of Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, an indigenous nonprofit organization on the Pine Ridge Reservation, seeking to lead systemic change through the development of a regenerative community with the ultimate vision of a liberated Lakota nation through language, culture, and spirituality. Michael Vitken Our next panelist is a member of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, a past director of the program in Native American Studies and a professor in the Department of American Culture and History at the University of Michigan. His publications include An Infinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Early North America, and American Indians in World History in the Oxford Handbook of American Indian History. Michael's work explores the juxtaposition of Native and European experiences and responses to the process of mutual discovery that created the New World in North America, with a particular focus on the Great Lakes and Great Plains. His current research examines the intersection of race, national identity, and state-making in the Old Northwest of the early Republic, and includes the essay Seeing Red, Race, Citizenship, and Indigeneity in the Old Northwest, published in the Journal of the Early Republic in 2018, and awarded the Ralph Gray Prize for Best Original Article by the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. He's also the author of Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, Black Lives, and Political Economy of Plunder in North America, which is forthcoming with the press of the Omonhundo Institute for the Study of Early American History and Culture. And our third panelist, Janene Yazzie. Janene is an entrepreneur, community organizer, and Indigenous rights and human rights advocate. She has worked on climate change, water security, food security, broadband development, energy development, and nation building with Indigenous communities for the past 11 years. She served as a research associate in several studies looking at the impacts of environmental contamination on Indigenous communities in New Mexico and Arizona. She co-founded the first community-led watershed planning program on the Navajo Nation, known as the Little Colorado River Watershed Planning Project. Currently, she is program manager of sustainable community development with the International Indian Treaty Council. She also represents the Treaty Council as the co-convenor of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group to the UN High-Level Political Forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. She ran for New Mexico Public Regulations Commission in 2018, and she is an alumna of Columbia. I will first give the floor to Michael Vitken because he has to leave us early because of his teaching. And we would like also to give him the chance to hear others with their comments and questions. So Michael, you go first.
Thank you for providing us this opportunity. I'll try to be brief and I'll speak. I think I'm an historian, so I'm not working in present day, but I can speak to the historical context of voting and inclusion, Native peoples. My first brief is an attempt to sort of recenter early American history on Native peoples who were the majority of people. These small settler colonies on the eastern seaboard take up so much of the history in academic circles. So I wanted to recenter Native history. And I kind of came to my second project, which looked at the early republic, the immediate aftermath of the revolution with a similar lens. The revolution came to a conclusion with the Treaty of Paris, which gave essentially all the territory from the Mississippi River Valley to the Appalachian Mountains to the United States. Even though that territory was owned and controlled by Native people, the United States thought of it as a sort of unsettled wilderness and part of the public domain of the kind of settler republic. And so immediately after the revolution, in a historical context of thinking about voting rights and belonging and not belonging, the Congress formed a committee on Indian affairs and approached George Washington, the president, and asked him for advice on America's Indian policy. And George Washington responded that America's Indian policy is a land policy. In other words, he said, you can't really think about Indian policy without thinking about land policy, signaling his intention that American expansion necessarily involved the idea that Native peoples would be dispossessed, and the United States needed to find a way to do that without being continually engaged in costly wars. So from the outset of the Republic, which liked to think of itself not as a colonial power, but as a post-colonial nation, it was in fact designing settler colonial ambitions for expansion into Indian territory. And this took the form of a policy called the Northwest Ordinance, or land policy, which imagined that the Native peoples in the territory between the Appalachians and west of the Mississippi had title to land, but they didn't own it because they hadn't converted it into private property, and that the treaty process would extinguish Native title, compensate Indians for that extinction of title, and then shift land into the public domain as states expanded. And the Northwest Ordinance created a whole mechanism for replicating the sort of original 13 colonies in the West. You needed 5,000 white settlers in order to form a territory, 60,000 white settlers in order to form a state. This whole process was predicated on the idea of expansion. There were, of course, two really violent wars where the Americans were defeated. Two consecutive losses after the Revolution at the hands of Native People Confederacy in the Northwest Territory, which convinced the Native people, or convinced the United States, that their idea of not having a standing army wouldn't work. So they created a standing army, went back to war, fought to a standstill, and then was able to sort of recognize the need to shift toward George Washington's original idea of a treaty process. And so the book that I've just completed, that Elsa mentioned, has looked at this process of essentially the United States trying to grind out states in this Northwest Territory as they were able to sort of coercively force Native people to ceding title to land and then opening that land for settlement. And one of the things that happens is that the trajectory in the Northwest Territory is that you have a majority Native population. In a place like Michigan, for example, which is created as a territory with 5,000 white settlers in 1805, it remains an indigenous majority territory almost up until the time it becomes a state. It becomes a state in 1837, but it doesn't have a non-indigenous minority until after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1826, because there's not a whole lot of reasons to be in northern Michigan, for example, in 1820. Because you can't access the markets of the United States. So the economy of Michigan is the fur trade. And so to the extent that there are non-Native people there, they're involved in the fur trade. So you have this process where the United States is trying to fashion states out of largely indigenous territory. And they're having to wrestle with the fact that they still have large indigenous populations. In places like Ohio, south of Michigan, this is less of a problem because Ohio, through the Ohio River, connects to the Mississippi, and Mississippi connects to cities like New Orleans and St. Louis, so you're more connected to a market economy. And the Ohio Territory settles really fast. They flip the demography quite successfully and are able to sort of coercively not only negotiate cessions from Native people, but they're able to sort of by swamping the territory with non-Native settlement, make it harder and harder for Native people to live life the way they had in a sort of usual and custom means by a seasonal round, hunting and fishing, agriculture. In Michigan, this is a much more gradual process because, as I said, the settlement patterns are less quick to shift. And so in the state of Michigan, they're forced to grapple, as they are also in Ohio, but they're forced to grapple with what do we do with this large indigenous population? And the reason it's a factor is that Native peoples aren't citizens of the United States. They aren't citizens until the 20th century. But you have this large population. So if we think about American history, you think about a place like, say, Virginia or Plymouth Colony, which becomes Massachusetts, you have this long colonial history, over a century long, where the sort of demographic shift occurs over that century, and where you have a chance for people thinking about the place of Native peoples in or outside of the settler society over this century-long period. In a place like Michigan or Ohio, this is condensed to a decade or a decade and a half, where people are wrestling with a Native population, and do they belong or do they not belong? And because the Native peoples are non-citizens, you have these large non-citizen populations within the states. Now, Michigan, as I mentioned, begins to settle more densely after the Erie Canal opens up, and it makes it more practical to settle there. And in 1820, for example, before the Erie Canal, the non-white population or the non-Native population of Michigan is less than 10,000. In 1837, when Michigan enters the state, I think the population in the Lower Peninsula alone has gone up to over 100,000 non-Native people. So you've flipped the demography in the space of 10 years from Native people being a majority to being in a minority. So places like the state of Michigan that are rapidly, this transformation is rapid, unlike, say, the early colonial settlements. And that forces the state legislators to deal with a non-citizen population in the state. This is also the era of Indian removal, and in this time period, the response that the American politicians have is that they decide that the Indians can't be assimilated, they don't want to be assimilated, and so Indian removal is a policy designed to forcibly remove Native people east of the Mississippi onto territory that's called Indian Territory in the west, which would now be Oklahoma. In Michigan and Wisconsin, as parts of the old Northwest Territory that were slower to be settled by non-Native people, Native peoples are able to muster enough political power still to resist removal and essentially to reject the removal policies that are built into treaties, and negotiate an ability not only to stay in their land on much reduced homelands, but to exercise sovereign rights to hunt and fish on land that has been, where they've ceded title, but that hasn't been settled by Native settlers. And this ends up being really important in 20th century for mobilizing sovereignty and Native rights, the land use practices that are encoded in the treaty relationship between the United States and Native tribes. The other thing that as this is going on and state legislators are trying to make state laws and form states, and they're trying to come to grips with what to do with this Native population, they have the issue of what to do with mixed race Native peoples who are, as I mentioned before, fur trade has been important. Lots of mixed race people who are attached to the fur trade are also connected to their communities, Anishinaabe communities in the Great Lakes. And there gets to be a question about whether or not they have rights as citizens because of their mixed race identity. And increasingly, mixed race people try to assert that dual citizenship, that they're both indigenous but also citizens of the United States. And they are asserting this as a way of trying to mobilize some of the power that they can in a republic that's designed to exclude Native people. And they meet with mixed success. In some cases, they're awarded rights as citizens, and they're able to do things like sit in juries, run for office and be public officials. But in other cases, their identity as citizens is denied. It tends to go back and forth. And so in my latest book, I looked at a number of court cases where people are looking at things like voting rights or ability to sit on a jury. And you have a kind of mixed success. Some cases, people are regarded as mixed race, but also citizens. And in some cases, there's a denial. The interesting thing in the case law is that the denial of mixed race status in Michigan Territory, in terms of citizenship rights, tends to be linked to the status of free Black people in the same territory. In the Northwest Territory, the ordinance that I mentioned that creates a mechanism for making states that as they enter the Union create constitutions. In every Northwest Ordinance Territory state, which there's a provision that they all have to be free states. That is, they have to be states that don't allow slavery, and they have to have a fugitive slave clause, which is a way of sort of saying that in the Southwest, places like Georgia and Alabama, you can't just move to Michigan and declare your freedom because there's a fugitive slave clause that's a part of the Northwest Ordinance for any new constitution. So states are wrestling with constitutions and belonging, and they have to have this fugitive slave clause, but they also, in every single Northwest Ordinance state, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan, they enact Black laws, which are designed to prevent and prohibit free Black citizens from migrating to the states. These usually mean that you have to both, if you move into Michigan or Ohio, prove that you are not a slave, that you have to have your freedom papers. You have to go to the county clerk in the area that you're moving and post a $500 bond that is presented along with your proof that you are not an enslaved or escaped slave person. $500 in 1830 is a lot of money, something that wasn't available to most free Black people. There are penalties for employers who employ free Black people who haven't proved that they are in fact free. So there's a system of laws that are put in place designed to inhibit free Black movement into this supposedly free soil territory of the United States. And to the extent that citizenship rights for mixed race Native peoples is contested, it's usually because in the courts, there's an argument that if we begin to give rights to mixed race Native people, we're going to also have to give rights to free Black people. So you see early on in the Northwest Territory, in the early Republic, people wrestling with both a process that is designed inherently to dispossess Native people, but also trying to figure out what to do then with the dispossessed people. Do they have rights or do they not? And that is very quickly linked with the sort of desire to regulate Black bodies and Black persons and sort of deny them full access to the franchise. And in the Northwest Ordinance, these two things are completely linked. And so that remains the case that as the Northwest, as expansion of the Northwest happens, thinking about Indigenous dispossession, Black freedom and ability to participate in civil society, Native people's ability to participate in civil society, these things are completely linked, even in its foundational period. And so as I'm writing this book last summer to looking at these issues and how people in these states imagine themselves creating these new state institutions and trying to wrestle with what to do with Black and Native populations within their territory, they're seeing them as inextricably linked. And as I'm working through this, you have things like Standing Rock, which erupts, and you have things like Ferguson, which erupts. And so I'll just kind of conclude by saying, the takeaway for me as an historian, as somebody who's not necessarily working in present day situations or thinking about the present day, is that I can't escape the fact that you can't but see the present day experiences in places like Ferguson or Standing Rock as disconnected from the history of the United States and its founding moments. This feature in the system where we're looking to dispossess and disenfranchise Native people at the same time we're disenfranchising Black people is a feature of the Republic. It's not a bug. It's not a problem that comes up. It's how the system has been designed. And when I'm working on this historic moment of creation and thinking about this present moment where the exact same problems are happening, you can't but see them as being not only interconnected, but part of the structure of the United States. And so I don't think we can separate things that happen in North Dakota where you have the legislature that are trying to systematically disenfranchise Native voters by changing voter registration laws, or things like Ferguson or anti-Black violence that have been happening over this past summer. You can't disentangle these things from the structural composition of the United States as a republic, as a settler colony. And I'll just kind of wrap up with that and say thank you for giving me a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think that the historic perspective makes so clear this systemic situation and how the way you are linking with Black lives, Black and brown lives. There is a question already that somebody would like, and I would like you, if you can give us 5 more minutes. How do we connect what we can learn from history to understand electoral participation and influence of Indigenous peoples today? If you can speak a little bit more to that, there is a question that came in.
Sure, I think the way that we can kind of connect with that is just to realize, as I said, that this is a feature of the system, and so therefore it's the structure of our system is. Let me start. Often people think that the United States is an experiment in self-government, which it is, and it's based on this notion of all people being equal. But at these founding moments, all people weren't thought of as equal, and citizenship wasn't thought of something that provided the same bundle of rights to every person. Citizenship, even in the early republic, allocated different kinds of rights to different people. Women had different rights. Free Black people had different rights. Native people had no rights. So this is a structural feature of the American system, and being cognizant of that means that we have to be self-aware that we have to look out for these things. When my great-great-grandfather was coursing to sign a treaty that created the reservation, Red Cliff Reservation, in 1842, and extinguished title to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan because the United States wanted the mineral rights. There was a lot of copper in the Upper Peninsula, and they were at the time trying to include a removal clause, and Gitche my relative, said that he would only side, first he said no, and then they said, well, we're taking the land anyway, so if you want compensation for it, we sign the treaty. And he agreed only if they included a clause where he said that we can't be removed, we stay in our homeland so that my children's children can be in our homeland. And I think so this is a gamble that paid off. So my family is still in the region. My family is still able to sort of be in their homeland. And this is a kind of through line connection for me in thinking that this has been a struggle. And as I mentioned before, Native peoples now have begun, I think in the 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, to begin to figure out ways to mobilize sovereignty. That has been restricted by treaties, but still there. And so I think just being conscious of that and being conscious of things like Standing Rock or what I mentioned in North Dakota are not anomalies that have happened, but there are features in the system, and being prepared to fight back for that, to reassert sovereignty, to insert that America is in this ongoing structural relationship with Native peoples that's designed to eliminate and that resistance is an ongoing and active thing, and that it's linked to other freedom struggles, like the struggles we have seen exploding over this past summer with the death of George Floyd. It's very much linked to those same freedom struggles, because these are both features of an American system that was originally designed not to be inclusive, but to be selective in terms of who was able to enjoy those rights. So I guess I would only just say that being aware of the Republic is being structured the way it's been structured means that we're in an ongoing battle that calls for resistance, open resistance.
Exactly. I wanted to ask Janene and Tatewin whether they would like to jump in on this historical perspective and the thread that Michael is giving us before he leaves us, because he has to leave us. I don't know if you would like to make a comment or say something to what Michael said, even before your introductory comments.
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate it, Michael. I was trying to take notes, sitting here in my car, trying to keep service so that I can stay on this. But, you know, you brought up a lot of very important points that I think are very fundamental in our political understanding of how the system has been structured from the onset and how it continues to operate to this day. I think, you know, I empathize, and I have worked on the side of trying to do the get out the vote drives and get people registered to vote and engaged in the electoral process. And I realized how important it is in doing that type of work to still offer that genuine and that true historical political education, so that we're not inadvertently in that process of trying to use the electoral process to exercise our self-determination and to ensure that we're continuing to advance our rights as Indigenous peoples, while also teaching her own relatives to buy into an illusion that this system works in that way. And, you know, with the foundation that you provided about how this all started with the taking of land, the conversion of private property, the development of rules and legal frameworks that dictates who is included and who can benefit from that system, is a legacy that we've inherited and still struggle with today. So much of the rules around who's qualified for office, who can run, who can even access the resources to run for office, are still very much controlled by those same values and by those same rules of what a political leader needs to look like and needs to do even when they gain office. And one of the things that I learned in the work that I was doing and in my own experience running for office is how obscure a lot of these offices are and the people who are put into them, and how much power they hold over continuing legislating and holding authority and power to uphold the theft, the development, and the continued extraction of resources in our lands, territories, and our sacred places, our sacred territories. And so we cannot operate or do this type of political engagement or have this type of instruction or discussion without that historical context. We don't have that luxury, we don't have that privilege, and it actually works counter to our goals of self-determination and understanding how to strategically engage in these systems and in these processes to uphold our inherent rights as Indigenous peoples. And so I really appreciate everything that you said. And I think that one of the things that also needs to be empathized is that you provided a very specific historical background and experience in the Northwest Territories. And we also have to be conscious about how these strategies and the way that it's spread through westward expansion changed and evolved through relationships with different Indigenous peoples and the diversity of our cultures, languages, and our forms of resistance. And that each of those also hold a piece of the puzzle that is necessary for our holistic understanding for how to engage in the system as a whole. And so I really appreciate everything you brought to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Janene. Tatewin, would you like to comment before we lose Michael?
Just to echo what Janene said, just really appreciate the historical perspective. It's almost like as Indigenous people, when you hear it, it's a trigger for the invisibility that we face as Indigenous people. So it's when you hear those things, you wonder how many of those that are listening today or that will listen in the future, how many individuals know that history and know that truth from an Indigenous perspective. And I think it's, you know, it's a part of the historical trauma that we all experience as Indigenous people to have that invisibility as a group of people. And so I appreciate any time, you know, our history is shared in these spaces, because I think it's really important. But then it's also serves as a call to action for those that do not know the history, you know, including members of our own communities. So we understand how these systems were designed, not for us, but, you know, dictated and imposed upon us. And so, you know, I really appreciated that comment by Michael, that they were designed this way. They were designed to exclude and to suppress and oppress. And, you know, that just gets to the heart of, you know, how do we galvanize, how do we empower community members in our Indigenous communities to want to be a part of a process that wasn't designed for them? You know, that's a question that I've always had. And my father, the late Russell Means, he always used to say, if voting could change anything, it would be illegal. And, you know, when I was asked to be a part of this panel, I was really thinking about that. And I too ran for political office in South Dakota. I ran for the Democratic nomination for Attorney General. I was, I don't want to say coerced, but kind of, by the Democratic Attorney General's Association, because they wanted more women of color, especially, to run for political offices. And South Dakota is an extremely red state and extremely conservative. So, you know, even winning the Democratic nomination was a long shot, but then even winning the election overall was even farther. But I did because I felt it was important to start to break down those barriers, but it really opened my eyes to just how broken this system is. It's not about what's best for communities or who has the most experience or, you know, who's connected to the communities. It's really about money. And that's what the system is founded on, you know, white settler colonial systems, white supremacist systems. It's those connections and the connections that you have to money and wealth and that perceived power. And so I think in order to galvanize Indigenous communities to vote, we really have to take a look at why do we keep knocking on the door of a system, begging to be let in, that was never designed for us and will never be, right? So how do we radically transform the system? And to do that, we have to have allies in that process. And so, you know, I really appreciate this panel and this opportunity to share because of our invisibility as Indigenous people, it's really important to have more allyship in this process.
Thank you so much, Tatewin. I want to say, Michael, we need to free you from our panel because I know you have to go teach your class, but I really want to thank you so much. There are more questions coming to my mind, but we'll try to deal with them in your absence. Thank you again, Michael, for being with us. And I know that Colombia loves you a lot. You have come to Colombia several times to speak. Thank you so much again. And we will be in touch and we will let you know when the link is available so that everybody can have it as a record. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. So now I turn to Tatewin Means, and I am also very glad that in your previous comment, Tatewin, you mentioned your father, who has been such an extraordinary leader at national and international level. And actually one of the most amazing photographs that we like to show of the Indigenous peoples movement breaking through the barriers of the United Nations in 1977 is a photograph where your father walks in front of the line and enters the grounds of the United Nations. So it is an extraordinary legacy that we have. So I would like to give you the opportunity to make your opening remarks if you would like.
I feel like I kind of just did, but I guess in addition to the comments that I already mentioned, my name is Tatewin. I am, as mentioned in my bio, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota of Oceti Sakowin territory in what is now South Dakota. I'm the executive director of Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, which is a grassroots nonprofit organization in the Pine Ridge Reservation. The Oglala Sioux tribe is one of 9 tribal nations in the state of South Dakota. We comprise approximately 10% of the state's population, but of course, all sorts of disproportionate representation in the criminal justice systems and et cetera. And I think, you know, that the conversation around disenfranchisement of Indigenous people has to also include a conversation around the voting rights of previously convicted individuals. Once they've served their sentences, they're regaining their ability to vote is really important. And I know it's, you know, a mixture across the states as to which states allow that to happen. But because of our disproportionate representation in justice systems, criminal justice systems, whether it's state or federal, that's a really important conversation to have when we talk about Indigenous voting rights. Additionally, I mean, as you know, as a grassroots community organization, we work a lot. We really pride ourselves on the level of community engagement that we're able to do in our communities. You know, we're a large land-based tribe with over 2.5 million acres. And so it's really expansive in reaching the different sectors of our population. But, you know, that's also a contributing factor to the access to voting, voter registration, you know, all of those complexities. We live it because we're such an expansive territory. And I think recently the Oglala Sioux tribe and the Rosebud Sioux tribe, with the help of NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, filed suit in federal court here in South Dakota against the state of South Dakota for violating the National Voter Registration Act, for not providing opportunities to Indigenous people in South Dakota and access to voter registration opportunities. And so, you know, I think that's one mechanism that Indigenous people and specifically tribal governments have utilized in asserting their rights, asserting our rights, is using the legal mechanism to help enforce those. And so, you know, my background is in law, and, you know, as a former attorney general, you know, I think about all of those things when it comes to our communities and access to voting. But it always comes back to that question of how can we convince our communities and our people to vote in a system that won't protect them or honor them. And it almost feels, you know, disingenuous to say, get out the vote, let's go vote, but not really fully believe in the system. And so, you know, that's a quandary I think a lot of Indigenous people are in, because either side of the aisle, Democratic or Republican, administrations historically have, you know, not really recognized or upheld Indigenous rights. It doesn't matter if it's, and people I think always think Democrats associate with Indigenous rights, and that's not always the case, actually. And so, you know, how can you have a representative government with only 2 political parties? And so, you know, I'm a staunch advocate for how do we transform the system? How do we make our own system as Indigenous communities and recognized tribes here on this land? And, you know, my father led an effort at the UN to have Indigenous representation there permanently, you know, not through a forum, not through a special rapporteur, but actually have a permanent seat at the table. And I think that's a starting point, actually. But, you know, following that line of thinking, how do we include that in the United States government system, permanent seats for Indigenous people, you know, at Congress, in the Senate, at all levels of government. So those are just some of my initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Tatewin. And many questions come to mind from your introduction, but I would like to first ask Janene to jump in with her some comments, and then comments of her own, comments on what you discussed, and then we can go back to these questions. So, Janene.
Yeah. First of all, right on, Tatewin. Yes, thank you so much for naming so many of those things that I think often are ignored when we're talking about these issues, because we really should be talking about not only the voting rights of our relatives who have been held in federal prison because criminal jurisdiction works differently regarding crimes on tribal territories, and because of the history of criminalizing not just Black and brown bodies in general, but in particular for our Indigenous peoples, land rights and human rights defenders, and how, you know, like this has created a cumulative effect of disenfranchisement that gets inherited through these families. But I think one of the other things that needs to be named in terms of the social political barriers, many that are very obvious to the general electorate, but a lot of people don't realize how our name, how deficient our educational system is, our public educational system is in educating, especially Indigenous youth, about their history, their rights, both as citizens of America and the United States, but also as citizens of their own sovereign nations. And so when our people are of voting age, we are left to our own devices, basically, to try to navigate those very complex political institutions and the barriers that have been set up that cause a lot of confusion over how we participate as active citizens in our tribal communities and in the wider general public, in our municipalities, in our county elections. And I think that's all done purposefully. You know, like this is an easy fix, something that could be fixed in the political education of through our public education systems. But there's a reason why that isn't being taught. And I think that naming that really helps illustrate kind of how far we need to go and how deep we need to go in order to offer a comprehensive, meaningful political education. Because one of the things that Michael said that I really loved and I think bears repeating is that we exercise and retain treaty rights, fishing rights, and all of these things by exercising and building our political power. And that did not begin and end with our right to vote. We can and should still be building our political power outside these institutions, because throughout history, that is what served us the best to exercise our self-determination and the protection of our communities and of our peoples, and securing a future for our peoples. And I think that bears reminding even today, because there's this sense of urgency to get the white supremacists out of office, right? But I think we also need to be accurate in our language that we're trying to get rid of the rude white supremacists, you know, like the sloppy white supremacists. But we have always had white supremacy holding power and elected to all levels of office in this country, because that is how the system has fundamentally been structured to work. I've also been carrying the same conundrum, because I understand both reactions to the current political situations that we're dealing with. I understand why we have more people who are recognizing and trying to engage and committing themselves to organizing around getting people out to vote. And I also very much feel the pushback against the way that that's being done, and the way, I've seen a slogan recently about how voting is sacred, and the way that that's triggered some of our most hardcore land rights and human rights defenders, and our people who are trying to restore our traditional forms of governance, who are trying to exercise our inherent rights as sovereign peoples, to respect and rebuild our sustainable and holistic and culturally informed ways of living, about that type of framing. Because participating in the system is not sacred. Participating in the system can be an effective and meaningful strategy to deal with our current political context, but we have to recognize and hold this conflict, because we need to develop a better solution and a better response for how to inform and prepare our people for political engagement in these systems. I think Cornel West recently spoke about this, and about how the power of the vote can be used as a strategy against white supremacy, but we must maintain the responsibility to not buy into the illusion that that participation is going to affect meaningful change. As Indigenous peoples, we have had Democrats in office, we've had Republicans in office, and nothing has changed for our peoples on the ground. And right now, and with this urgency to get Trump out of office, we're being forced to vote for Biden and for Kamala Harris, who neither can show what they have done throughout their political history and their years in politics, what they have done to actually understand, let alone change, the conditions faced by Indigenous peoples and the systemic inequalities and systemic oppressions that we continue to have to fight against, even in the midst of a pandemic. You know, like Standing Rock happened under Obama. Like, we can't forget that. Like, and it was finished under Trump. And in the midst of this pandemic, whether we had Democrats or Republicans in power at the county and at the city level, our peoples were still not being given the resources and the support necessary to adequately address and prevent community spread, in order to prepare our communities with health care and health-informed responses that centered language justice, that centered culturally appropriate responses to this pandemic. And we're not getting that in the recovery responses either. And so, you know, even though we can empathize with the urgency to change power and to ensure that we stem and we address and we name the way that this administration in particular has galvanized white supremacists all around our communities, we still have a responsibility to also mobilize and build our political power outside these systems. And I think that that's the only way to really hold that contradiction that we're feeling about trying to get people to care more and to be more engaged. But I also think that it is a result of Standing Rock and Black Lives Matter that people are being more critically conscious about their engagement and are focusing a lot more on local elections and the people who are coming into power in these positions that were otherwise ignored, are just taken for granted, you know, we're kind of obscure in the visibility and the anonymity of the people who hold power locally. And so I think that is one of the benefits, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, Janene, very much. And I think that both of you are making the link between how the strengthening of sovereign governance within Indigenous nations in this country might also help galvanize stronger participation or change of the system. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, some people feel that they interpret the right to self-determination as Indigenous peoples having an extra strengthened right, meaning that because Indigenous peoples can also participate as collectivities, their voice, especially through treaties, as collectivities in the national system, as well as individual citizens that everybody else can do. How do we link these voices and the sovereign voices? And this has also to do with with enhanced ways of political participation, how we can imagine, you know. And I wonder also whether this is a moment that Indigenous peoples in this country are, because of the situation that we all know that we're going through, it is a moment of galvanizing more together voices, you know, for these political changes regarding Indigenous political participation.
So I'd like to comment to that. So it's interesting to me when folks talk about self-determination or sovereignty, and it seems like it's always connected or in connection with government or in relation to this broader US system, right? And so the work that we do at Thunder Valley is about liberation. And the one thing that we understand, have come to know, is that liberation, self-determination, sovereignty, all of those things that are interconnected start with the self. Self-sovereignty, self-liberation is first. And the first step of that is healing. To find healing, to be able to heal from historical traumas, existing traumas, generational traumas. And once you can find that personal liberation, that self-liberation, that then extends out to your immediate family, your extended family, your nation, and on and on. It's the start of a movement, it's the start of a ripple of liberation, right? Because you're changing mindsets. You're changing mindsets from one of this culture of poverty and survival mode to one that is free, right? And this freedom to be responsible. You're responsible to yourself, your family, your work, your colleagues. This is something we continually talk about within our organization and with our community, because it doesn't matter if we do elect folks into the Senate, into Congress, into state offices. If we don't have that healing collectively as a nation, if we don't have that liberation collectively as a nation and have that mindset, it'll be repeating the same. We often hold up and highlight individuals that can make it that far, but what change do we see come from that? Because they're one voice out of how many, right? And so I think that the most important conversation to have around how do we get people involved, education is absolutely one. So I appreciate Janene in saying that. But not only like Indigenous education, but all education systems should be learning Indigenous history and Indigenous rights. But even more important is that collective healing, that collective liberation that has to happen. It is tied to other movements. It is tied to, the movements of other communities of color, other marginalized communities, but we can't be so outwardly focused all the time, right? Like I said earlier, like always knocking on the door, trying to get a seat at a table that was never designed for us. It's something that a lot of times I think we can spend our energy looking inward and how do we heal here first and then move on. Because there's this big movement happening on social media, a lot of conversation around land back movement for Indigenous people. And, I was thinking about that, and one, we have to stop using colonizer terms and colonizer narratives, right? When we talk about land in that way, it's a possession. And that's how white settler colonialism looked at land. It was a possession to be had, to be moved from here to here, title, all of those things. And so, denouncing white settler narratives, this concept of power also is very colonial. It was under these auspices of power or perceived power that our nations were subjugated, that our nations have been oppressed, and acts of genocide were committed because there was a group of people that felt they had this inherent right to subjugate others in the name of God a lot of times, right? And so, I just think about being really cognizant and conscious about the language we use, especially as Indigenous people, is so important, because we don't want to be facsimiles of white power. We don't want to be facsimiles of that. We don't want to repeat that same history, that same rhetoric, and those same systems. And so to do that, we really have to focus on our own liberation as Indigenous people.
Thank you, Tatewin. Janene, you want to say something about that?
No, absolutely. A lot of important points were brought up in this. And one of the first things that comes to mind is about this issue around power and how we relate to it, how we understand it. And one of a really interesting exercise that I learned from one of my close friends and colleagues, Chrissy Castro, who does amazing political organizing work, is this exercise they brought to Indigenous communities where they ask Indigenous youth, what is power? And there was little to no responses about what is power. But they asked them, what does it feel like to not have power? And every hand goes up in all of these meetings. And so there's something there. There's something there about not being able to explain power, especially as Indigenous peoples, because we have a completely different understanding culturally, and as well as based on our lived experiences on what power is. For us, I think a lot of times our minds go to inherent power, the power of nature, natural law, our original instructions, the power of our ceremonies. You know, there's a lot of ways to think about power and to define it, but we do know, living in this political society, what it means to be without power under these particular structures that look at power and the exercise of it in a particular way. And that particular way is rooted in white supremacy and those values of dominance and of righteous superiority based on these organized religions, and the way that all of that's been embedded into our political systems through the doctrine of discovery and the original documents that founded this nation, the creation of this country. So I think that there's something there that really does need to be broken down. And this goes back to your question, Elsa, about what does it mean to build that collectively? And I've heard of so many different dreams and so many different movements and attempts over time to build that collective power among Indigenous nations. Does that look, and what does that look like? Asking and talking about modern day treaty making, restoring our trade relationships, aligning and collaborating to create our own political party, to create our own pacts. And all of these, I think, are still in various stages of development and of discussion by different groups. But, you know, I don't want what Tatewin is bringing and asking for us to focus on to be lost, because it's vitally important. That work to build power does begin with ourselves, and it begins with, and we have to center healing in that process, because with all of the ways that we have inherited historical trauma and this conditioning and assimilation and indoctrination into these white supremacist based structures, we have also embedded and carried out those characteristics in ourselves. And so one of the issues that I think is emblematic of this is the push to just elect more natives to office, right? I come from an area where my peoples have had the luxury of serving as a significant voting bloc in local city and municipal elections. And we have had our own people elected to those offices. But when we are not simultaneously tackling the issues, the inherent issues in these political processes and in these institutions, and we're not simultaneously tackling and naming the power and influence of money in these elections, we can have as many people that look like me elected to these offices still carrying out the same agenda against our peoples and against and in contradiction to our tribal sovereignty. And I also think that I see this conflict as well at the international level and at the UN level. I hear the arguments from tribal governments about how they deserve a seat at the table and should be on par, but they're not simultaneously talking about whether those tribal governments actually reflect the traditional governance structures that our peoples need, want, and have been advocating for. A lot of our tribal governments have been structured for us through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The process of electing and voting and going through that sort of process to elect our leaders has been indoctrinated and brought to our lands. And right now, when we're seeing people addressing simultaneously and fighting on all these fronts for the protection of our land, our territories, our resources, for the land back movement even, we're having to really think about all of these things and how they manifest in our political responses and strategies. Because if we don't do that work, we're going to inadvertently replicate these cycles and replicate this process and further assimilate ourselves into a system that needs to be dismantled, and where we need to really put just as much energy, commitment, and effort, if not more, into rebuilding our traditional structures of governance units that adequately represent us and all our peoples. We have a tribal government system right now that is considered one of the most advanced tribal government systems because we have a 3-branch process. We have a 3-branch system, like, you know, copy and pasted from the federal government. And it is in that tribal government that we are still criminalizing and creating barriers to same-sex marriage, like and villainizing an entire part of our population that has always had a traditional and respected role in our communities, that have our relatives that have always had value. And we see how this has a real effect in the way that we carry out our modern traditions and the way we identify in this modern society as Indigenous peoples. And so these things need to be addressed, and we're not going to be able to really develop the solutions to this if we're afraid to have these conversations, if we're afraid to name these contradictions, and if we're afraid to have and point out ways that we can inadvertently carry out and replicate these processes with the language that we use. I know a lot of work has been done for the Land Back movement, for example, to really redefine and try to clarify that it's not about ownership over the land, but about being able to reassert our responsibilities to land bases. But I know it's not done in such a level that everyone who uses that term understands the importance of making that clarification. And so I think we do have a lot of work to do. And I just really want to thank Tatewin for reminding us that work really does begin at the individual level and really begins around centering our healing and really deconstructing. I believe that part of that healing is deconstructing the ways that we've been conditioned ourselves to replicate and normalize these harmful concepts and the way that we use them to build our strategies.
Yes, it is. In fact, this what you are mentioning is really the ideas that are critical and are critical dismantling some dominant concepts about what democracy is, what true equality and democracy is. I feel that through your movement, you can really help the broader society as well, the white society, democratize itself as well. But what you were saying about power, the concept of power, and the kids, you know, not being able to define it, but being able to understand what is not, what lack of power is. I want to say that I was impressed that in one of the recent election platforms that I was watching on TV, I had been very eager to see somebody that had been invited from Navajo to appear at one of those platforms. It had been advertised broadly by Navajo through social media, and I had seen it. And then when I go to see during this Congress, you know, what was happening, in fact, you see that 1 second of this Navajo leader, I was so shocked myself. It is the idea, you know, of how do you raise this critical voice without becoming, how can I say, without becoming completely disappearing yourself in this system and losing self. So it's very important what you say, Tatewin, about this finding self as individually, but also as a nation, as a community. But I also wanted to ask you, because we are getting some questions from the audience about, you know, people are asking, how can we help? How can we help this work that you are doing? Is there something that we can do from academia or from as civil society? Because you know, we do see that there are shrinking civic spaces these days. So how can we grasp this moment that these elections have galvanized in this country and support your work? So if you can speak a little bit about that and the solidarities that we can build on.
I'll go ahead and start. I think forums like this are definitely vital and necessary. It's been interesting how I've definitely seen a shift in the midst of this pandemic and the use of technology to connect us and continue important conversations, recognizing, you know, all of the different issues that are being held at the same time. I've seen more courageous formats being proposed for how to have this dialogue. And I think that this is one of the most difficult things to accomplish in an age of social media, of sound bites, where people's attention spans are even shorter, and you know, like these catchy headlines that oversimplify or overgeneralize a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, and making the bulk of the political education and the access to the information that is put out there in an accessible way for the general public. And so I think using platforms like this to bring together conversations that dig deeper into this issue is very important, to link us to other groups that are also having these conversations at the same time. But I think in academia, you know, and I've seen this since the AIM movement, one of the biggest I think advantages or benefits that was brought out in the AIM movement was the creation of language, of political language, to help people better understand these dynamics and how they play out and affect us in our everyday lived experiences. And I think that that served as a phenomenal tool to educate and to empower a whole new generation of Indigenous rights advocates and thinkers and professionals and experts, because it planted a seed of consciousness in all of these youth that they've carried throughout their different pathways into adulthood and into whatever career path that they chose. And the power of that, I think, was really shown through this pandemic, in terms of like how for the Navajo Nation in particular, I've seen how in the midst of the lack of federal or government responses and the development of resources, people from every walks of life, from our business owners to our grassroots advocates to our skateboarders, to our unemployed youth, to our medical professionals, to our language keepers, mobilize to fill those gaps and provide the resources necessary for our people. And I think that that was an extraordinary demonstration of what our capacity is and the possibilities are for mobilizing for the systemic change and the transformation that we actually need. We just can't get married to our strategies. And I think Winona LaDuke is one of the people that emphasizes that a lot. They're like, let's not get married to our strategies. Let's not just focus on get out to vote and neglect all this other work that needs to be done. Let's not misappropriate like important terms about our inherent sovereignty and our self-determination, and inadvertently be sucked into systems and structures that actually work to further assimilate us into these institutions. Like, let's be conscious and set that envelope or set that bar higher once again, so that while we're simultaneously trying to figure this out together and doing that hard work to deconstruct and find our pathways for collective healing, as well as that individual work to decolonize ourselves, let's also make sure that we're extending this knowledge and building these pathways to leadership for the next generation. Because one of the things that I think I learned in running for office was how, you know, these systems of power are so seductive and so I don't know what the word is, but like effective at making political leadership a career. You know, like I was just running for office for the first time. It was a thing that I felt a very strong conviction for at the time. It was an attempt to bring better representation for my people, to be able to somehow try to enact stronger regulations against these extractive industries and these companies that benefit off the exploitation of our lands, territories, and resources. But even in that process, a map was being laid out for me from like the democratic machine and the parties and the peoples engaged in this, for the next 12 to
Mhm.
20 years of my life. And that's not what we look at as Indigenous peoples in terms of leadership. You have to constantly earn that respect and that response, the right to carry out that responsibility on behalf of your peoples. But we don't have leadership structures like that. Our political system doesn't work like that. And that's why we have career politicians when we should be having our grassroots advocates and our frontline defenders and our mothers and our teachers being the ones that set the direction for political agendas and solutions and for policy solutions, being silenced and marginalized in these discussions. And I think that we have to think about all of these things and really fight for the type of transformative change that needs to be done, using this moment where people are paying more attention than ever to the importance of voting or not, and to the importance of the elections, and trying to learn more about their leadership, to really start to question like the whole structure at its core, and start to advocate for something better, because we all deserve better representation.
Yes. Janine, thank you. And this leads me like to a final thought here. I was recently reading that it was 1948 that Indigenous people in this country were given the right to vote. That's what I read. And recently we saw that there have been some more Indigenous leaders that were elected to political office, right? Do you see that as useful? Do you see that as one path or one pebble in constructing, in expanding Indigenous voices in the United States?
I just wanted to quickly touch on your last question in regards to what can people do in allyship, in support of Indigenous communities. And one, I think it always goes back to educating yourselves on Indigenous history in total on this land, but specifically in the areas that you are, in the regions that you are. Who are the Indigenous peoples that are there, that were there? What is their history? And the most important part is, what are they doing now? Who are the leaders? Who are the community organizers? And making meaningful connections to those groups. I think another really important act of solidarity and allyship is supporting Indigenous-led organizations. We know our communities best, and we are leading these efforts and solutions in our communities. And so having support from those that are beyond our communities is always really important and integral to sustaining our efforts. I think additionally, questioning political leaders, your political leaders, whether it's in your state, in your town, however that takes shape, but asking them their position on various Indigenous issues. Like I said, because our numbers are small, on a national perspective, it's important to have our voices amplified in these conversations. And so having that kind of advocacy from allies is also really important in questioning existing leadership. So I just wanted to add that much to that conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if there is any other concluding statement. I think we got our orders. We heard you, we hear you, all of us that are in this event, and those that will watch it afterwards. Yes, you are in the front seat, of course, and you know what is best for your communities, and solidarity means supporting your leadership in this. So we are very glad to hear you and that you are here with us today. I don't know if there is any other, I'm just looking. I think we are, you want to say something, Janine? Are we okay? Any concluding remark before?
Yeah, I just, I feel like we kind of left with a heavy question, and I think it's an important one, and one that I have a lot of conflicting feelings about as well, because I don't know if the goal should be looking at increasing our representation in politics. I mean, I really felt Tatewin when she was talking about how she felt coerced into running, because that was an element that was in my own political run as well. You know, there's a certain level of tokenization that comes when you make the goal to increase like the number of people who can check off a box and sit in these offices. And I think there's a lot of harm that can be done with that type of identity politics that takes us further away from the type of representational government that we really need. The conflict, I think, is an important one, because there is a lot of energy and resources going into trying to identify and recruit the right Indigenous peoples to then provide support for and running for these offices. But you know, once in my experience, even running for a local office for a fairly, you know, rural state, a small state, a minority state, the influence of dark money and big money and even those types of runs is phenomenal, and definitely speaks to how broken even the system is, even when it comes to measuring it against our illusions of how we think the system needs to operate. And so, and for me, because of that experience, I constantly question how and why certain candidates are getting elected to these offices, even when they're supposed to come from our Indigenous communities. And I think that it's a healthy level of skepticism that speaks to the historic distrust of these systems in general, but also is necessary because of the very real issues that we have with money and politics in our current political system. And so I saw that there was also a question on the Q&A that I was going to try to answer, but I just wanted to uphold what Mary is saying about needing to integrate this into the curriculum at all levels, because I think that for me, going to Native American Preparatory Academy, our NAPS, during my first 2 years of high school was what was my beginning, my first introduction into political history and accurate history of Indigenous peoples and the relations with the United States. And if I didn't have that, I would not have had the foundation for my advocacy that helped carry me through even Columbia University. Because we still, you know, as you know, Elsa, when I was there, we were still fighting to have our history and even just the visibility of our peoples incorporated and recognized in the curriculum of the institution. And so there has been progress made since then, but we need to, like, the progress needs to stop being piecemeal. It needs to be systemic. It needs to be holistic, and we have to have it integrated across all systems of education and of political engagement and political organizing. Everyone has a responsibility to learn about this history, to become critically aware of the Indigenous peoples within their communities, because we're everywhere. There's no place where you're free from that responsibility. And we all need to be incorporating that into our strategies, especially if we are people of color, are women of color led. We have to operate from that sense of intersectionality and improve our strategies so that we're not replicating these cycles and these strategies in the way that we're advocating for our liberation.
Janene, thank you for bringing it back to education. I am an advocate of us having a mandatory course at Columbia University on Indigenous peoples. It's my, it has to be mandatory. For example, at the University of Mexico, UNAM, which is the biggest university in Mexico, they have a mandatory such course for all students, whether they're medical students, chemistry, law, it doesn't matter. Everybody has to take that course. So yes, education. So I would like to thank you for being here with us, for your precious comments. And now Christina would like to make some concluding remarks. Christina.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Elsa, and to our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time and for such an engaging discussion. I think we all learned a lot, and so I want to thank you. And finally, I just want to flag our last discussion as part of this series, which will be this Friday at 1 p.m. It's on elections and human rights classrooms and teaching the day after the elections. So I hope you'll all be able to join us. And for those who may be interested in sharing this discussion with others, it will be available on our website by tomorrow. So thank you again very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.